To Philosopher King's Rise. A world on the edge. History often remembers emperors as conquerors, tyrants, or visionaries. Few, however, stand as paradoxes of power rulers who wielded absolute authority yet sought wisdom above dominion. Marcus Aurelius, the last of the 5 good emperors, was one such figure. A philosopher forced into war, a thinker burdened with empire, and a man who, despite wielding absolute power, questioned the very nature of existence. To understand his reign, we must first step into the world of Rome at its peak in empire, at the height of its influence yet standing on the precipice of decline. The Rome of Marcus Aurelius. The Roman Empire of the 2nd century AD was a realm of contrasts. At its heart, the imperial city of Rome pulsed with wealth and grandeur, marble temples, bustling forums, and vast arenas filled with cheering crowds. Yet, beyond its polished facade lay the challenges of an overextended empire. By the time Marcus was born in AD 121, Rome had reached its zenith. The Mediterranean world, once a patchwork of warring states, was now unified under Roman rule. Roads stretched across continents, legions guarded distant frontiers, and trade flourished from Britannia to Syria. But beneath this golden exterior, cracks were beginning to form. The empire's economy depended heavily on expansion, yet no major conquests had been made in decades. The bureaucracy was growing inefficient, corruption was taking root, and Rome's reliance on slave labor stifled technological progress. It was in this complex world that Marcus Aurelius came of age, shaped by both its grandeur and its flaws. The young philosopher, born into a wealthy and influential family, Marcus Annius Verus was raised in an environment of privilege. His grandfather had been a powerful senator, and his family had accumulated immense wealth through trade. Yet, from an early age, Marcus showed little interest in luxury. Unlike many aristocratic youths, he was drawn not to politics or pleasure, but to philosophy. His tutors noted his sharp intellect and quiet nature, and his fascination with Stoic teaching set him apart. At the age of 6, he caught the attention of Emperor Hadrian, who saw in him the potential for greatness. The emperor arranged for him to receive the best education Rome had to offer, surrounding him with scholars, philosophers, and statesmen. As a boy, Marcus admired the Stoics, men who preached discipline, virtue, and self-control. He was particularly drawn to Epictetus, a former slave turned philosopher whose teachings emphasized temperance in the face of suffering. This fascination with Stoicism would shape his entire life. While other noble youths indulged in luxury, Marcus practiced sleeping on the floor, wearing simple clothing, and denying himself pleasure. He sought strength not in wealth, but in wisdom. The path to power. In AD 138, the political landscape of Rome shifted dramatically. Emperor Hadrian, aging and without a direct heir, sought to secure the future of the empire. He adopted Antoninus Pius as his successor, with a crucial condition: Antoninus had to adopt Marcus Aurelius and another young noble, Lucius Verus, as his heirs. At just 17 years old, Marcus was suddenly thrust into the line of succession. The weight of the empire's future now rested on his shoulders. Though he was reluctant, he accepted his fate with characteristic Stoic resolve. He immersed himself in state affairs, learning governance, law, and military strategy. Over the years, he served in various administrative roles, gaining experience in the complex machinery of the empire. His mentor, the renowned orator Cornelius Fronto, trained him in rhetoric and politics. Meanwhile, Junius Rusticus, a Stoic philosopher, guided him in matters of wisdom and virtue. Despite his growing responsibilities, Marcus remained introspective. He saw power not as a privilege, but as a duty, a burden he would one day have to bear. An unlikely emperor, for over 2 decades, Antoninus Pius ruled Rome with stability and prudence. His reign was peaceful, marked by economic prosperity and careful governance. Marcus, ever the loyal student, watched and learned. Unlike many imperial heirs, he showed no impatience for power. He waited, studied, and prepared himself for the day he would take the throne. In AD 161, that day arrived. Antoninus Pius, now 74 years old, fell ill and died. As he lay on his deathbed, he left Marcus with a final request: treat the empire as you would your family. Marcus Aurelius, at the age of 40, was now emperor, but in an unprecedented move, he refused to rule alone. He insisted that his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, be made co-emperor, a decision that would shape the future of Rome. It was a moment of humility, a break from the power struggles that had defined previous successions. Yet, as history would soon show, Rome was entering an era of immense challenges. The empire Marcus inherited was stable, but that stability would not last. Soon, war, plague, and betrayal would test him in ways no emperor had faced before. The trials of an emperor, the weight of power. Marcus Aurelius never sought the throne. He never craved power, nor did he lust for conquest like some of his predecessors. Yet, fate thrust upon him the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. For all his wisdom, for all his philosophical contemplation, Marcus soon realized that ruling Rome was not about recent debates or grand ideals, it was about survival. No emperor had ever faced the sheer weight of crises that would descend upon Marcus Aurelius in the coming years. His reign would be defined by war, plague, and betrayal. And yet, in the face of it all, he would cling to his principles. He would struggle, he would suffer, but he would endure. Rome had known many emperors before him, but few would be tested as he was. The question was, could the philosopher king rise to the challenge, or would his dreams of virtue crumble under the brutal realities of empire? The war in the East. The first real test of Marcus' reign arrived almost immediately. For years, Rome's eastern border had remained relatively peaceful under Antoninus Pius, but that peace had been deceptive. The Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival in the East, had merely been biding its time. In the autumn of AD 161, barely 6 months into Marcus' rule, the Parthian king Vologases IV launched a full-scale invasion of Armenia, Rome's client kingdom. The initial Roman response was disastrous. Roman forces sent to repel the invasion were crushed, their commanders humiliated. Soon, the Parthians were advancing into Syria, and panic spread across the eastern provinces. Neither Marcus nor his co-emperor Lucius Verus had any real military experience. Yet, while Marcus was tied to Rome's administration, Verus was dispatched to the front, though not as a warrior, but as a figurehead. The real work would be done by Rome's veteran generals. Despite his lack of experience, Verus treated the campaign as a grand spectacle. Instead of marching directly to the front, he lingered in Antioch, indulging in feasts, theater, and luxury, while his generals waged war in his name. Meanwhile, the Parthians continued their rampage. They seized Roman outposts, slaughtered defenders, and threatened to push deep into Syria. Marcus knew that if Rome lost the East, it would shatter the empire's prestige. But then, the tide turned. The Roman war machine, once properly mobilized, was nearly unstoppable. Led by generals like Aurelius Cassius, Roman legions struck back with terrifying efficiency. In a series of brutal campaigns, they pushed the Parthians out of Armenia and invaded Mesopotamia. By AD 165, they had not only defeated the Parthians, but had burned their twin capitals Seleucia and Ctesiphon to the ground. It was a victory worthy of celebration, but Rome would not have long to enjoy its triumph, for the legions returning home were not alone. They carried something with them that would change history forever: a silent, invisible killer. The Antonine Plague. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a minor illness. Soldiers returning from the East reported fevers, chills, and fatigue. But soon, the symptoms grew worse. Pustules covered bodies, people coughed up blood, and death followed in days. What Rome did not yet realize was that it was facing one of the deadliest pandemics in its history. Modern scholars believe it was smallpox or measles, but to the Romans, it was something far worse. The Antonine Plague, as it came to be known, tore through the empire like wildfire. It spread from the legions to the cities, from the cities to the countryside. No one was safe. Tens of thousands died in Rome alone. In the empire's densely packed urban centers, corpses piled in the streets, and the stench of death filled the air. The empire's manpower, its lifeblood, was being drained. Entire villages were wiped out. Legions were left critically undermanned. Tax revenues plummeted. Rome had always relied on a steady stream of soldiers, workers, and administrators to keep the machine running. Now, that machine was faltering. Marcus Aurelius did everything he could to contain the disaster. He funded relief efforts, organized burials, and tried to keep the people calm. He even turned to religion, ordering massive public sacrifices to appease the gods. But nothing could stop the plague's march. Some estimated that a quarter of the empire's population perished. And as Rome reeled from the devastation, an even greater threat arose, one that could not be reasoned with: the barbarian invasions. Rome's frontiers had always been under threat, but the crisis of the plague had emboldened the empire's enemies. Across the Danube, the Germanic tribes had been watching Rome grow weaker. Now, they saw their chance. In AD 166, a massive confederation of Germanic and Sarmatian tribes surged across the Danube, attacking Roman territory with ferocity. It was the largest invasion Rome had faced in centuries. Entire provinces were ravaged, cities were burned to the ground. Refugees poured south, bringing tales of slaughter and ruin. And then, in a move that shook Rome to its core, the barbarian horde crossed into Italy itself. No enemy had set foot on Italian soil since the days of the Cimbri and Teutones, over 300 years earlier. But now, the Germanic invaders reached as far as Aquilare, just north of the Italian heartland. Panic gripped the empire. Rome was not prepared for this. The legions, weakened by the plague, were struggling to muster the numbers needed for defense. In desperation, Marcus took drastic action. Criminals and slaves were conscripted into the army. Gladiators were given their freedom in exchange for service. Even senators were expected to contribute to the war effort. To fund the campaign, Marcus went so far as to sell off the imperial treasures, golden goblets, fine jewelry, even the Empress Faustina's dresses. No emperor had ever done such a thing. But Marcus did not care for appearances, he cared only for saving Rome. And so, in AD 168, Marcus did what he had never done before. He left Rome and rode to the front. A philosopher at war, the man who had spent his youth immersed in philosophy, who had written of virtue and self-discipline, now found himself in the thick of war. For years, Marcus led Rome's armies against the Germanic tribes, battling the Marcomanni, the Quadi, and the Sarmatians. It was a brutal, grinding war, one that saw entire barbarian villages razed, their people slaughtered or enslaved. Marcus had no love for war, but he knew it was necessary. Rome could not afford to appear weak. If it fell here, it would fall everywhere. But the war took its toll. Marcus, already of frail health, suffered under the harsh conditions of the frontier. He endured freezing winters, sleepless nights, and the constant stress of command. And yet, even in the midst of the bloodshed, he found time to write. It was during these hard years that he penned what would become one of history's greatest philosophical works, Meditations. While others sought comfort in luxury, Marcus sought solace in wisdom. In his writings, he reminded himself to remain steadfast, to embrace hardship, to act justly even when surrounded by cruelty. His words were not written for the public, but for himself, a personal guide to surviving the unbearable weight of empire. And he would need it, for even as he fought to hold Rome's borders, new threats were rising, threats that would challenge everything he had worked for. War and wisdom, the burden of the crown. No emperor could escape the weight of the purple. For Marcus Aurelius, that burden was not just one of governance, but of survival itself. He had inherited a Rome seemingly at its peak, a vast empire stretching from Britannia to Mesopotamia, basking in the prosperity of the Pax Romana. But that golden age was an illusion. Beneath the surface, Rome was cracking, and fate had chosen him to hold the pieces together. War, plague, treachery, each had come in relentless waves, testing him in ways no ruler before him had endured. And though Marcus was a man of peace, a man of philosophy, he now found himself leading armies across the frozen battlefields of the Danube, locked in a struggle not just for victory, but for the very survival of Rome. Could a man devoted to wisdom and virtue navigate the brutality of war? Could a stoic philosopher truly thrive in a world ruled by the sword? This was the great paradox of Marcus Aurelius, the thinker who had to become a warrior, the idealist who had to face the cruel reality of empire. And as the Marcomannic Wars raged on, that reality would test him like never before. The Danube wore a fight for survival. By AD 170, Marcus Aurelius had transformed from a reluctant ruler into a seasoned commander. The Germanic invasions had forced him into a role he had never desired, supreme military leader of an empire under siege. For years, Rome's legions had fought a brutal, back-and-forth struggle against the Marcomanni, Quadi, and Sarmatians. These tribes, sensing Rome's weakness after the Annian plague, had flooded across the Danube, pillaging and destroying as they went. Now, Marcus had brought the fight to them. Unlike the Roman campaigns of the past, this was no simple conquest. It was a war of survival. The legions had to push the enemy back beyond the Danube, secure Rome's frontiers, and ensure that such an invasion could never happen again. But Marcus knew that brute force alone would not be enough. These were not traditional enemies with centralized capitals or organized governments. The Germanic tribes were mobile, loosely aligned groups, skilled at ambush warfare and survival in the harsh northern landscapes. To defeat them, Marcus had to think like them, so he adapted. He restructured Rome's defenses, fortifying key positions along the Danube. He built roads and supply chains deep into enemy territory. He authorized preemptive strikes, attacking before the tribes could unite, and he rewarded defectors, using internal divisions among the barbarians to his advantage. It was slow, grinding warfare. Cities were razed, entire tribes exterminated, and Roman legions bled for every mile of territory reclaimed. But Marcus pressed on, year after year, unwilling to yield an inch. And then, just as victory seemed within reach, Rome was shaken by an unexpected betrayal. The revolt of Aurelius Cassius. While Marcus was deep in the Danube front, far away in the eastern provinces, a dangerous rumor began to spread. It whispered that the emperor was dead. In Cappadocia, Aurelius Cassius, one of Rome's most skilled generals, heard the news. A veteran of the Parthian War and a man with a fearsome reputation, Cassius had long believed himself more suited to rule than Marcus. So, without waiting for confirmation, he declared himself emperor. It was a bold move, and for a moment, it seemed like it might succeed. Cassius commanded legions in the east, controlled Egypt, the empire's primary grain supplier, and had the support of powerful allies. He had expected Marcus' death to create the leadership vacuum. But Marcus was not dead, and when news of the usurpation reached him, the philosopher king faced a decision that would define his character. Most emperors would have responded with immediate vengeance. Civil war was a death sentence for an empire already stretched thin. But Marcus refused to act rashly. Instead, he took his time, sending envoys to negotiate, giving Cassius a chance to surrender peacefully. But before a battle could even take place, Cassius was murdered by his own officers. His severed head was sent to Marcus as proof of his loyalty. Marcus refused to look at it. Instead, he did something unheard of. He granted a full pardon to Cassius' supporters. He refused to order purges, refused to execute his rival's family, and sought reconciliation rather than retribution. In this, he remained true to his Stoic ideals. To Marcus, revenge was a destructive force. He believed in ruling by wisdom, not by fear. But some senators sought his mercy as weakness. Had he been too lenient? Could his refusal to act with ruthlessness cost Rome in the long run? For now, the empire remained intact. But the cracks were deepening, and Marcus knew that his war was far from over. The Meditations of Stoics, reflection on power. Throughout the years of war and betrayal, Marcus Aurelius continued to write. His words, jotted down in the solitude of his tent or the quiet moments between battles, would become one of the most influential philosophical works in history. Meditations. These were not grand political treatises or proclamations for the empire. They were personal thoughts, written for himself alone, a guide to enduring hardship, embracing virtue, and confronting the harsh realities of life. He reminded himself to remain calm in the face of adversity. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. He urged himself to act justly, even when surrounded by corruption. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. And in moments of doubt, he sought solace in the idea that all things, power, wealth, even life itself, were fleeting. Soon you will have forgotten all things, and all things will have forgotten you. It was in these writings that Marcus' true greatness lay, not in his victories, not in his laws, but in his unshakable commitment to virtue. Even in the midst of chaos, he was not a perfect man. He made mistakes. He struggled with doubts. But unlike many rulers, he never abandoned the principles he held dear. Yet, for all his wisdom, Marcus could not escape the one great tragedy of his reign: his own succession. The rise of Commodus. Marcus Aurelius had spent his entire life fighting for Rome. He had battled enemies on all fronts, endured disease and treachery, and ruled with wisdom and restraint. But the one battle he failed to win was against fate itself. In AD 177, Marcus made a decision that would shape Rome's future, and not for the better. He named his son, Commodus, as his co-emperor. It was a decision born out of necessity. Marcus was aging, his health declining. He needed an heir to stabilize the empire. But Commodus was not his father. He was not wise, nor disciplined, nor prepared for the immense responsibility of rule. Some senators warned Marcus against this choice. They urged him to adopt a more suitable heir, to follow the example of Nerva, who had chosen capable men rather than blood relatives. But Marcus, for all his wisdom, could not break the tradition of dynastic succession. Perhaps he believed he could guide Commodus, shape him into a worthy ruler. Perhaps he hoped the empire would survive despite his son's flaws. But deep down, he must have known the truth. Rome would not be the same under Commodus, and in the years to come, that truth would become painfully clear. The final campaign and the fall of the Pax Romana, the last emperor of Rome's golden age. Marcus Aurelius had fought his entire life against forces that sought to tear Rome apart, invading tribes, devastating plagues, and even treachery from within. Yet, through it all, he had remained steadfast, a stoic emperor ruling with wisdom and endurance. But no man, not even a philosopher king, could fight forever. As the 170s AD drew to a close, Marcus was nearing the end of his strength. His body, weakened by years of hardship and sickness, was failing him. And yet, there was no peace, no final years of reflection or rest. The war on the Danube still raged, and the fate of Rome hung in the balance. And beyond that war loomed an even greater threat, not from barbarian invaders, but from within his own household. His son and heir, Commodus, was not the man Rome needed. The decision to place him on the throne would prove to be the great tragedy of Marcus' life, the fatal flaw that would undo everything he had built. This was not just the end of an emperor. This was the end of an era. The death of Marcus Aurelius would mark the final breath of the Pax Romana, the last moment of stability before Rome plunged into the darkness of corruption, civil war, and decline. And so, as we witness the final chapter of Marcus' reign, we must ask, was this the inevitable fate of Rome, or could things have turned out differently? The last war of Marcus Aurelius. By AD 178, Marcus Aurelius was preparing for what would be his final campaign. The Marcomannic Wars had been raging for over a decade, and though the Roman legions had won many victories, the Germanic tribes were still a threat. Marcus knew that the only way to secure Rome's northern frontier was to crush the enemy once and for all. And so, despite his failing health, he led his legions back to the Danube. His plan was ambitious, not just to defeat the tribes, but to permanently annex their lands into the empire. This was not merely a defensive war, it was an offensive push to secure Rome's borders for generations to come. Had he succeeded, Germania might have become another Roman province, much like Gaul had centuries earlier. But Marcus' body was not as strong as his mind. The harsh conditions of the northern frontier, combined with years of fatigue and illness, took their toll. By early AD 180, the emperor had grown gravely ill. His condition deteriorated quickly, and it became clear that his time was running out. His legions, loyal as ever, gathered around their dying emperor. He had led them through hardship and war, and now they prepared to say goodbye. And yet, Marcus' mind was still on Rome. He knew that his death would leave the empire in a fragile state, and so, with his final breath, he placed his trust in his son, Commodus. It would be the one mistake that would undo everything he had fought for. The death of Marcus Aurelius. On March 17, AD 180, Marcus Aurelius passed away in his military camp in Vindobona, modern-day Vienna. His death was not marked by grand ceremony or extravagant rituals. He died as he had lived, humbly, accepting the inevitable with stoic calm. According to one account, as he lay dying, a tribune approached him and asked for the night's watchword. His response was poetic, yet ominous. "Go to the rising sun, for I am already setting." It was a symbolic passing of the torch. Commodus was now emperor. The soldiers mourned their fallen leader, for they had loved him as no other emperor before him. But Rome itself would soon realize the weight of what had been lost. With Marcus' death, the last truly great emperor of the Pax Romana was gone. What followed would be the rapid unraveling of everything he had built. Commodus, the beginning of the end. Commodus had been raised in the imperial court, surrounded by wealth and luxury. But unlike his father, he had no love for philosophy, no patience for governance, and no interest in military affairs. Where Marcus had been disciplined and introspective, Commodus was reckless and indulgent. Where his father had spent years on campaign, leading his legions in battle, Commodus wanted only to enjoy the pleasures of Rome. His first act as emperor, abandoning the Danube front and making peace with the Germanic tribes. It was a move that shocked Rome's military leaders after years of war. Victory had been within their grasp. But Commodus cared little for strategy. He wanted to return to the capital, to the grand palaces and games, to the life of excess that awaited him. And in Rome, excess became the defining trait of his rule. Commodus surrounded himself with sycophants and corrupt advisors, handing over much of the empire's administration to them. While he indulged in extravagant gladiatorial contests, he saw himself not just as an emperor, but as a god, even renaming Rome after himself and styling himself as the reincarnation of Hercules. The contrast between father and son could not have been greater. And yet, the real tragedy was not just Commodus himself, but what he represented, the beginning of Rome's decline into tyranny, chaos, and civil war. Under his rule, the cracks in the empire widened, corruption flourished, the economy suffered, and the once disciplined legions grew disillusioned. The Pax Romana, which had endured for nearly 200 years, was unraveling before Rome's very eyes. And the worst was yet to come. The fall of the Pax Romana. With Commodus, Rome did not immediately collapse. The empire would endure for another 300 years in the west, and even longer in the east. But the spirit of Rome, the disciplined, stable, and unified empire that Marcus Aurelius had fought to protect, was dying. Commodus' reign set a dangerous precedent. He ruled not as a statesman, but as a despot, indulging in whims and crushing dissent. And when he was eventually assassinated in AD 192, the empire was thrown into chaos. The year that followed AD 193 became known as the Year of the Five Emperors, a bloody period of civil war in which generals and senators fought for the throne. The empire that had once stood unshaken under Marcus Aurelius was now crumbling under the weight of its own instability. Historians have long debated whether Rome's decline was inevitable. Could Marcus have chosen a better successor? Could his vision of a strong, disciplined empire have endured, if not for Commodus? We can only speculate, but what we do know is that his death marked the end of Rome's golden age. To dream of a wise, just, and philosophical ruler guiding Rome had died with Marcus, and in its place, chaos took root. The philosopher king's legacy. Marcus Aurelius remains one of history's most fascinating rulers. He was a man who never sought power, yet bore its weight with dignity. A philosopher who did not shy away from war, yet never let it corrupt his soul. His legacy endures not in conquests or monuments, but in words. His meditations written in the harsh realities of war continue to inspire thinkers, leaders, and ordinary people seeking guidance in an uncertain world. And yet, his greatest tragedy was that he could not save Rome from its own fate. The empire he fought to preserve would never be the same after him. The Pax Romana, the golden age of stability and prosperity, ended with his passing. Rome would continue, but it would never again have a ruler like Marcus Aurelius. And so, we are left with one final question. Was Marcus Aurelius the last great emperor? Or was he simply the last emperor who truly understood what it meant to rule? That, perhaps, is a question that history itself has yet to answer.